My name is Elliot Williams. I'm the training manager at the National Press Club Journalism Institute. And as a local journalist myself, I personally know the importance of trainings and resource sharing for journalists on a community, state, and regional level. Here at the Institute, our goal is to power journalism in the public interest through trainings at a free or low cost. Today's program is, of course, part of that mission, so we thank you all for being here. Before we begin, I'd like to note that we are recording this program. Feel free to submit questions using the chat or the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screens, and your questions will be addressed throughout and at the end of the program. And let us know again where you're tuning in from as you're signing in. Moderating today's conversation is Fahmy Redwood. Fahmy is a news manager and on-air journalist, as well as the host and creator of the award-winning podcast Beyond Black History Month. She's a board member of NLGJA, the Association of LGBTQ Journalists, and the chair of the National Association of Black Journalists LGBTQ Task Force. Fahmy has reported for CBS News, Vice News, and other national outlets covering intersectional issues. Most recently, she served as editorial director for Epicenter NYC, a newsletter that was born out of the need to connect neighbors during the pandemic. Thank you, Fahmy.
Hi, everyone. I am so excited to moderate this panel. Any questions that you have, please make sure you are dropping it in the chat. I want to make sure that we are helping everyone leave with really important information. Over the past several months, we have seen some very concerning national headlines, to say the least, everything from the cutting of funding for critical healthcare that disproportionately affects queer people, everything to the Trump administration's discriminatory passport policy that leaves trans Americans out in the lurch, and the list goes on. We know that local journalists are at the heart of upholding our democracy because of their ability to reach people where they're at with critical information. And we know how much our viewers, our readers, our listeners trust local journalists. So in times like this, it is important to reflect on how to better serve local journalism, our local communities, especially when covering queer stories, leave so much to be desired. So how do we elevate the voices that need to be heard? To help answer these questions, we have an amazing panel, and I am going to have everyone introduce themselves, starting with Bill. Don't forget to unmute, Bill. One day we're going to get.
Hi, everyone. My name is Bill Canacci. I'm the regional features editor at the Asbury Park Press and Gannett, New Jersey. I frequently write about LGBT issues in what we call a things to do story that happens. It's just something that I'm very passionate about, just making sure that, especially in this day and age, that when LGBT organizations have events going on, that we make sure that we let our readers know about them. Asbury Park has very significant LGBT community, and so it's just part of our day-to-day job that we should be covering this community, and this is one of the ways that we do it. I also try my best to let LGBT issues, just to let other editors at the press know that LGBT issues are happening, and just to provide a voice, I suppose, of the community. So
we're going to kick it to Sharif.
I should mention, there's a lot of NLGJA representation here. I've been a member of NLGJA since 1996.
Speaking of NLGJA, Sharif, take it away.
Sure. So Sharif Durhams, I am a managing editor at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. And Fahmy, you mentioned NLGJA. The association is going to be having its convention right down the street from our offices here in September. Fahmy, the other organization on which you're on a task force, NABJ, this National Association of Black Journalists, is going to have its convention here in Atlanta next year. So it's an exciting time to host journalists who are trying to do good work. I also am a board member of NLGJA and was the former national president.
Jacob.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me today. My name is Jacob, pronouns he, him, his. I am the news coordinator for GLAAD, where I connect local LGBTQ advocates with local media based here in Texas. I am from Dallas. I've previously worked with NBC Dallas, Dallas Morning News, other local journalism outlets, and now my job is to connect local advocates with the local media as GLAAD expands their work into local media.
Kae, I'm sorry.
No worries. Hi, I'm Kae Petrin. I use they, them pronouns. I am co-executive director of the Trans Journalist Association, as well as a co-founder. And I work as a data and graphics reporter at Civic News Company, and where I cover K-12 education, voting rights, and public health across the intersections of government accountability reporting and LGBTQ communities coverage.
Hi, I'm Kathryn Varn. I'm a reporter for Axios Tampa Bay. I use she, her pronouns. I cover everything from politics to arts and culture. I have also done a lot of reporting on the LGBTQ community in Tampa Bay and Florida. I previously worked for the Tampa Bay Times and for Gannett with USA Today Network Florida, and I live in Florida.
Kathryn, we're actually going to start with you. Walk us through your process of building diverse sources, especially in areas that might not have any obvious LGBTQ plus organizations.
Sure. I mean, I think there's a few ways. First, I mean, I think even places that don't have any obvious organizational presence, if you look a little, if you look a little harder, so a lot of times there will be, PFLAG organizations, or even Pride organizations, since we're in Pride Month. An example I think about a lot is Polk County, which is in the middle of Florida and a pretty conservative area. But they do have a Pride organization that started 10 years ago and has grown quite a bit in size. So, there's certainly avenues there of maybe not smaller organizations that you can look to. Another way I think that can be really helpful with sourcing is following if governments are doing something along the lines of like a Pride proclamation, or at the state level, there's legislation moving through the Capitol that impacts LGBTQ residents. Watching those meetings, or going to those meetings, a lot of times there's public comment, right? So people from the community will, step up and say, this is how such policy could affect me and my friends and neighbors and whatever. So that's been a way I found a lot of folks as well, is just watching or attending those meetings. And then typically those public comment, you have to fill out like a little form to speak at a meeting. And typically those forms are public record, or at least they are in Florida. And we do have a pretty broad public records law here. So I can't say it's the same for every state, but that a lot of times those forms will have contact information on it. So I'll follow up with folks like, hey, I saw you speak at this meeting and I'd really like to talk to you more about how this is affecting you. So that's another avenue. And then just being out in the community, I think, can go a long way as well. Going to protests, going to Pride events, and just being a member of your community and chatting with people at those events, not necessarily as a reporter, but maybe it can turn into a reporter source relationship if you meet someone that you want to develop that relationship with. But that's such a benefit of being a local reporter, right? Is that we can go out to our community that we cover and meet, just regular people in it. And that's a really beautiful thing, I think, about being a local reporter.
Bill, you cover arts, which is an area that is often seen as more inclusive of queer folks compared to other areas. But why is continued visibility, even in some seemingly inclusive spaces, still important across all these?
Well, as I will start with, I guess, the LGBT community. Just the fact that, for example, Two River Theater in Red Bank is hosting a drag show story time is critical because of everything that's been in the news. These organizations are frequently, I am told, they get these phone calls or emails about, how could you host this event and stuff like that. There really is some conservative parts of New Jersey, and the press happens to be in Monmouth and Ocean County, and there's, they are surprisingly conservative. At least that's one of the things that I found when I first came here. But to have these groups say, we are not going to disappear, we are not going to go away quietly. It's important to let readers know, especially in a community that has a significant LGBT population, that hey, this is going on. I would say the same thing for for example, there's a high autistic population in Ocean County specifically, and there's an autism fair. I mean, it's just, I think, really a question of doing your jobs, reporting that these things are going on, talking to these people, telling stories. All of that visibility is just, I think, just doing the work day in and day out. It's one of the things that I noticed that when Kathryn was talking, being there means something. Being there lets the community know that you're there, that here is somebody, they may not be necessarily a friend, but they will listen. And that's important because even if I can't necessarily do something, I can give it to this editor, I can give it to this writer. So just having that, I guess, visibility yourself, I think, matters to this community. And I would say that just knowing that you have, that you are there to just answer emails. I don't really get phone calls a whole lot anymore, but when, someone sends you something, follow up, let me know what your story is. I may not be able to do something, but somebody will.
Right. Speaking of visibility, Kae, you work mainly as a data journalist who partners with local reporters nationwide to tell these accountability stories, everything from public education to voting rights. How do you incorporate trans stories and all of that? But I'm also going to throw two questions at you. In addition to that, going back to the question that I asked Kathryn, how do you also build these diverse sources, especially in some of these local areas where trans folks may not be as visible because of safety reasons?
So I think there's sort of two pieces to this, which is number one, when we're thinking about local stories right now, we have a lot of really important, like long-standing, new legislation that's actively being implemented in states. We have some of these non-state level levers like school boards, department agencies that are sort of not directly passing laws, private institutions, athletic groups. All of those are sort of local entities that are doing things. And a lot of them are also, as Kathryn mentioned, creating public records as they're doing them, right? And so I think there's a huge opportunity for people focused on covering LGBTQ issues to dig into some of what's going on in the communities through those sort of local happenstances, especially because a lot of these groups are scrambling to react to federal activity right now. So we might not actually even be able to really tell the story at the national level because the feds might not be responding to FOIA, responding to inquiries, but all of these local institutions are having to figure out, how do we respond? What do we do? And that's a really rich area for storytelling that we've really leaned on at Chalkbeat and VoteBeat. Part of it's also thinking about where trans people fit into stories that aren't explicitly about LGBTQ communities. So, at VoteBeat, we did a story on the SAVE Act, which, trans people aren't the main conversation when it comes to voting rights and voting access. But when you just think about a potential proposed piece of legislation that changes the way IDs work in in elections, that has huge ramifications for any group of people that has some sort of issue getting access to IDs, right? And so I think thinking about, well, where is there a follow-up story in here that does apply to a larger story and extends to queer people can be a way in. Um, what was the second part of the question? The
You
two-part
kind of
question.
you kind of touched on it. Not only finding sources, but also just incorporating trans stories in all of that. But what I would love for you to do, if you have access to that story you mentioned, if you can drop it in the chat so that we can share it with everyone. But this leads me right into my next question. We talk about issues that are covering civil rights, specifically navigating that balance between objective reporting, avoiding that harmful both sides coverage that so often I myself find myself like yelling at the TV about. Sharif, as a managing editor, how do you guide your reporters through those decisions of avoiding the both sidisms, but also, that complicated balance that I think so many of us wrestle with?
I think it is complicated. I think first of all, on any of these issues, there's more than two sides, right? There are many sides. But we do have to reflect what is driving the politics in a local government, in a state, in the country. And so if either accurate or inaccurate perceptions of people are driving the conversation, then it is our responsibility to say, this is driving what's happening. Now, here are some facts about what's happening, whether they're true or not. But we have to be able to explain the world to people or explain Georgia or Atlanta to people. And if whatever information is causing the conversation to go in a certain way, we need to lay it out there. Now, if 3% of people are driving a conversation about issues that are relevant to them, we need to put that in context, right? And weigh that against other factors. So those are the ways that I try to think about our stories. It is key that whatever conclusions our stories draw, that our reporters are paying attention to information coming from all views. And, as people who are either LGBTQ, people of color, that's kind of how we live our lives, right? We have to understand people who aren't like us in order to survive and thrive. So we're often doing that. But we have to make sure, in my role, I have to make sure that everyone in our news organization who's touching these issues is doing that.
Right. Does anyone else have anything to add? Bill, I don't know if that was your hand up or.
I just put in the chat something from Michael McCarter, who's our opinion editor and the head of standards on LGBT coverage and best practices, regarding, what happens if you are getting quotes from bigoted, sexist, or anti-LGBT, well, maybe not bigoted people, but if they say something that is, definitely anti-LGBT, and how to approach that and how to go about it, which is really just, don't necessarily run what they say, but include references to opposing opinions, quotes, denying it from valid sources, etc. So that's what my company at least is saying when journalists when journalists deal with this issue.
Okay, James is asking for the article in the chat. James is unable to see it. James, I'm going to copy and paste it. Hopefully, you will be able to see it. If not, maybe there is a way for it to be included. I don't know, but we'll figure it out on the back end. So in addition to, Sharif and I being involved in NLGJA, Bill, you were a board member. I believe you're still a member. Kae, I know you were heavily involved in the Transgender Journalists Association. I'd love it if you all could talk about your volunteer roles in any of these organizations outside of your newsroom roles and how that does impact your journalism. And maybe it doesn't. Kae, I'm going to kick it to you just because you're in the center of my screen.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing that I often see, in particular, because I am volunteering with a journalism organization that does national level work, is sometimes a lot of the things that feel very, frustrating at an individual newsroom level, or like, my newsroom is doing this right, but, why isn't anybody else getting the message that we need to think about this a little differently as an industry? Working at the national level really can help you, uh, I think, see more movement and encourage more conversation and best practices in more newsrooms, which can feel a lot more, a lot less depressing than just sort of like being in one newsroom and feeling kind of helpless about, everyone's quoting this piece of misinformation credulously. But also being in a newsroom while I'm doing this work is really important and instructive, because having the on the ground reporting expertise, seeing what's really happening in individual states, and at the local level, it really informs that national level work and helps me understand, what do journalists actually need to do their jobs right now, and how can we speak to editors and reporters so they understand the importance of these stories and the tools that they can use to sort of fact check and make sure things are accurate, and think about, do we need to apply our source anonymity policy in this particular story, things like that. And so being able to just do that in a way that isn't sort of so insular, is really, I think it both makes my newsroom work better, and it feeds into the sort of journalism volunteer work as well.
Yeah. I'll just jump in and say one thing where it has impacted is having access, which everyone has access to, and I will drop them in the chat unless Elliot can drop them in the chat, but having access to these amazing style guides that all of these, or not all, but a lot of these organizations provide. NLGJA has a great style guide. It is helpful for both new journalists, experienced journalists. Sometimes I'm having to run back in and flip through. TJA has a style guide, GLAAD has a style guide. So in addition to what Kae said, sort of being inspired by seeing, some of the work that's happening in other newsrooms that you might miss, also just having really, really good access when you need it, especially if you're in a local newsroom where resources are very short and time is even shorter. Does anyone else have anything before we move on? All right.
Oh,
go ahead.
Sorry, I just want, along with the style guides, some organizations also have just useful like contextual resources. Like I'll drop this one from GLAAD in here about medical association statements in support of healthcare for transgender people and youth. So I've definitely turned to those resources before when, talking about, providing, fact-based information to contextualize, what folks are saying that may be based in inaccuracies or bigotry. So I will drop that in here. That's been really helpful.
And if anyone has any,
I'm sorry.
No,
I just
go
wanted
ahead.
to add that I think it's important to remember that, this is something that I think about all the time, but there are editors that I work with, there are editors in some of our sister publications that just don't really know the language and the appropriate language. There was an intern a few years ago who used the they pronouns, and an editor kept referring to this intern as she, repeatedly and repeatedly and repeatedly. And we made efforts to try to remind this editor that, they is the appropriate pronoun to use. It is difficult for some people, and I think it just is important to gently, sometimes not so gently, to just let people know that this matters and this is why it matters. And I will say that eventually this editor understood and changed. So it's just important to keep in mind that, when you do see or hear something in a staff meeting or whatever, I certainly am not afraid to say something. And I think it just is an educational opportunity, is what I would say.
And I just want to remind the audience, if you have any questions, please drop them in the chat. I want to make sure that you are leaving with information that is going to help your reporting. Jacob, from your perspective at GLAAD, what are some of the most common mistakes that you're seeing local journalists make when covering these stories, and what is your advice for avoiding them?
Well, I have to say that everyone's been really contributing great insights so far, and the things that I've wanted to say, they've kind of covered. But here, I'm gonna try my best to not be repetitive. You know, when I'm looking at local reporters, I do see a lot of good. I do see a lot of a willingness to reach out to local organizers, to the community, and ensure that representation is seen, especially in nonprofit newsrooms where we see a lot of young reporters who are either allies or part of the community themselves and know that that inclusive reporting is essential to covering the LGBTQ community. And yet, in the same breath, I would say that the worry about implied bias in local reporting is still something that is a major concern. GLAAD has tracked a number of LGBTQ focused reporting, and at the time of that reporting, no trans voices would be included in a story about the setbacks that the trans community faces. That's very concerning, especially when you're trying to uh, contextualize what the community is facing without an actual trans voice. Um, and President Trump's numerous executive orders and past statements attacking the transgender community, fewer than a third of that has included a transgender voice. And this is where kind of GLAAD comes into play. I am from Texas. I've always said that I'm a Texan first and then I work with GLAAD because I want there to be the connection where local reporters can feel like they can come to a media advocacy representative and they can feel connected to the community, can feel connected to Texas, to feel connected to the local LGBTQ community. Because once we get those voices included in local reporting and state reporting, that that obviously increases the level of empathy and the level of understanding for the readers itself. And I would also say, you know, I believe it was Kathryn earlier was talking about the public forums and comments that that are available at these public meetings. You know, in Texas specifically, a lot of those opportunities for members of the community are restricted. The current legislative session had many public hearings that limited the voices of LGBTQ voices. And this is where it's important to connect to your state organizations like an Equality Texas or an equality group that's based at your state, and making sure that you can connect to the community in numerous ways, despite the restrictions that state legislators have placed previously, and making sure that you find a way to connect with the LGBTQ community outside of those public forums.
And that's a story, right? Limiting public comment. I did a story about that a few years ago at the Florida Medical Board hearings that were the Florida Medical Board ended up banning gender affirming care for trans youth. And those meetings, there was a meeting where the public comment was shortened significantly, and they allowed a group of detransitioners that had flown in to comment first, and then ended the public comment early. And so there were, far more people there to speak against the gender affirming care restrictions, but that was not represented in the public comment. And so that became a story in and of itself. And of course, within that story, I, had public comment cards for all of these residents across the state who had come in, who, I was able to, talk to and start to build relationships with there. So sometimes that is the story, right? Is the limit of access and the limited forum to, for these voices to be heard.
Yeah, before we get to the next question, I'd love in the service of making sure and helping listeners, viewers, not make some of these mistakes that we've seen. I'd love it if anyone had any other insight on some of the mistakes that they've seen in local news and your advice for avoiding them. One thing that comes to mind, one of my pet peeves is if there is a story, a crime-related story, and the suspect happens to be trans, even though the crime had nothing to do with them being trans, so many headlines will still refer to this person as trans. Which is something that I rant about often. But if there's anything else that anyone has just noticed, and again, this is not to tear down local journalists, but in service of making sure they are covering these stories as accurately as possible.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the really big things that we see, particularly as local newsrooms have fewer and fewer resources to cover state houses, is that the journalists jumping in on legislation stories or response stories to new laws don't necessarily have a state house reporting background. And so one of the things that can happen there is that um, we see local stories that are overly reliant on what the politicians are saying about the bill. But if you go read the bill text directly contradicts what's being quoted, and that's not being conveyed. So this happened in Missouri when there was an executive order at the state level from the governor that he was saying, well, it's about children. We're only limiting healthcare for children. The executive order text did not specify that, and only one outlet caught that the executive order actually extended care restrictions to adults, and that also was not a law. So it was something where before it was challenged, it was theoretically going into place, within a month or two with very little notice, and adults may have been facing losing their health care had it not been blocked. But that was not something that was picked up by a lot of the reporters who were less familiar with, being able to jump into an executive order,
Right.
read the text and catch that nuance. So I think, being really attentive to, okay, there's a document, I need to read the whole document. If I don't know what it means, because I'm not normally a state house reporter, I'm not normally a legal reporter, I need to go talk to a legal expert about, what is in this and what is not in this, so that the political misinformation about what people are voting on or about what people are hearing about in the legislature does not become the dominant narrative, because it's our jobs to, point out when politicians are saying things that don't actually line up with what's going to happen.
That's a really great point.
Yeah.
Thank you. Does anyone have anything else?
Well, I was just gonna amplify Kay's comment and say that, when you're covering legislation that may be attacking the community, it's important to say, okay, well, this is affecting one community. I need to make sure that community we reach out to that community for the story. And not only that, this is where state equality groups come into play. Again, I'm going to keep amplifying my friends at Equality Texas, because they do great work where they are reading the fine print. They are going down these legislative languages that reporters who without the appropriate background will fail to respectfully interpret. So that's why, you reach out to the policy experts at these state organizations who have laid it out and found and have innovative ways through their social media, through online, to present the information in a more accurate lens, so you can avoid repeating the language of "we're protecting children, we're protecting women," false, harmful narratives that hurt transgender people. And that's why it's important to reach out to organizations like that. I mean, again, Equality Texas is one organization. I see that Kathryn has talked about Equality Florida. There's many organizations that are doing the work, especially in red states, especially where there are marginalized, voices in place that feel the setbacks, because we have to look for alternative options to make sure that we're being represented and heard. So it's important to make sure that you're, instead of looking to your government's language, that you're looking for your LGBT organizations. And I want to kind of just add on to another part. I know we're talking about local issues, but the federal policy of this administration is to erase trans people, and we've seen most mentions of the community erased by this current administration. And this is where GLAAD has come into play, to make sure that any resources, any data that are needed in reporting, that to contextualize the LGBTQ community to provide any statistics, to provide any insight. We are now taking under that we're not taking that responsibility because the federal government is choosing to erase us rather than acknowledge our existence. So again, it's just about reaching out to the appropriate sources and reaching out to the appropriate organizations.
Can I jump in with one more?
Sharif unmuted his mic, so I'm going to ask Sharif first if he has something, and then we'll pop back down to you, Kae.
Yeah, and I wanted to say, with the national debate created by, millions of dollars spent in ads discussing trans people during the election and before that, we have to understand that we have an obligation to talk about whether it's trans people or other people in the LGBTQ community outside of politics, us versus them stories. All that advertising did something to define who trans people are in the minds of a lot of people. And I think we have an obligation to talk to trans people in our community outside of the context of politics stories so people understand who trans people actually are in their community. So that when the political story does come up, they have context that is beyond what may have been put there in advertising, or that is outside of a story in which, in a partisan environment, people are going to go into that story with a perspective already.
Go ahead, Kae. Now's your time to shine.
Yeah, and sort of following both what Sharif and Jacob have said as well, I think it's also when we're thinking about what stories are we deciding to tell at the local level, the thing to keep in mind with the politics stories is that when you're thinking about a specific piece of legislation, it may also only directly impact a really specific subset of trans communities. For example, when we talk about gender affirming care restrictions, only about 30% of trans people receive gender affirming care. So those restrictions are really critical to cover. They're important stories, but also there's a huge subset of the community that is also impacted by, education policy, by any other like non-policy story, by things that are just happening in the world that we're not hearing from because we're sort of just covering this one set of policies or political stories that are very urgent, and the breaking news sort of dominates the conversation.
Right. So we got one question in the chat. They had to leave, but I still think it's a really good question. Let me go to it. Oh, here we go. So one person asked, what pronoun do you use when someone says their pronouns or whatever you want and that they go by all pronouns? Who would like to answer that?
I would say that you just take it, just use whatever you feel like is more comfortable in the moment. I have a colleague who uses any pronouns, and I comfortably use they because that's just I think that is just probably the best option in terms of just making sure that there's a neutrality to addressing them. But whenever you meet someone who maybe aligns more with your interpretation of a certain expression, if they go by all pronouns, then it's okay to kind of lean into that as well. The thing that's important though is that they did provide you the context to say it is okay to address me in this way. So there is no wrong way to do it. And you have the courtesy of knowing that their pronouns, are fluid and are any. And I think you're in a better position than you were previously than not knowing.
I would say that if Jacob says that, if Jacob uses any pronouns that they want, I'm using they in this context just to make the point, you're incredibly media savvy. And so you understand how people who might not be accepting will interpret the fact that those pronouns are being used. So I think if you're talking to someone who's not used to talking to the media, you may want to step back and say, okay, this is going to be viewed by people who don't regularly see pronouns that don't immediately reflect what they happen to perceive when they look at you. And so it helps me if you tell me which pronoun you might want to use, but feel free to not do that if you don't want to. But just like with stories when we are covering undocumented people who may not know the context of oh, this is going to be in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution and people are going to see this. We want to do that with all sorts of communities who are not used to talking to the media.
And then before I go to the next audience question, one thing that I have found, this doesn't apply for everyone, but one thing that I found in some of these cases is that someone will tell me that they use multiple pronouns because they're afraid of being misgendered. So they will give me a different pronoun because why even put yourself through that? So what I will sometimes do is ask, is there any that is your preferred pronoun? Again, not everyone. I've only found that in, some instances. So we got another question here from the audience. So Savannah is asking, how does reporting on Pride from a local perspective differ from national coverage? Well, there's a couple questions in here, so we'll first start with this part of the question. How does reporting on Pride from a local perspective differ from a national perspective? And what are respectful ways journalists can build trust with LGBTQ plus audiences? We kind of covered the second part of the question early on. If you want to go back and take a look at the video, but if anyone has any quick points to answer that second half of the question about how to build relationships, does anyone have any quick points that they can just reiterate again?
Sure. If it's okay, I'm gonna take a kind of a stab at this because there's a unique position that that I'm in with my. So I started off as a journalist. I've worked in many media outlets, and I know that community building is essential when you're trying to report. You need to have a personal relationship, a professional personal relationship with the sources, so they can ensure that that trust is felt. And one of the things that I've done now in my position at GLAAD is connecting with the community, on a personal level, so they can feel comfortable enough to say, okay, Jacob is looking for the appropriate source for a report from the Dallas Morning News. I'm willing to connect with them because I've built that trust with them. And part of that, my recommendation to journalists is, and I think Kathryn did mention this earlier, is to be part of the community itself. Go to these Pride events, go to these forums and discussions that where you might not even be covering the event or the topic itself, but that you're just at least getting an understanding of the community. You're meeting people, you're building those relationships. Go out for coffee or something, and at least have a conversation where you're able to level with them and understand them in a way that's outside of just you're looking for a report, you're looking to report on something. And one of the things that I've done as a community organizer and as someone with a background in journalism is that I volunteer with my local LGBTQ organization, Texas Latino Pride, and I've connected with many Latina and LGBTQ community members here in Dallas, and then ensured that their voices were later heard in essential reporting that affects their community. And that is because of trust. That is because of leaning into the fact that, I'm a Latina queer person in Dallas, and making sure that that's seen first, and then we can connect with the appropriate stories when it's necessary.
And I could jump in with two
Yeah.
quick points. With trust building, I think multiple panelists have mentioned this, but I think that really goes to the importance of talking to LGBTQ people when you're writing about a policy that's going to affect them, or writing about an issue that's going to affect them. And those stories beget more sources, right? Like you can, say you write a story about something and quote a couple queer people in your community, and then you're trying to cast a wider net or something, then you can, talk to those sources. Hey, do you have other folks I could talk to? You can send those people your story and say, or story, hopefully body of work, not just one story, and say, look, I've covered this, I've been committed to covering this, and this is how I've done it. And so you have more familiarity with my work and what I'm doing, and maybe will feel more comfortable to talk to me. Like that's something I would always try to do, is send a few stories their way so they know what's up, and how, just have an example of the work and get a sense of who I am as a journalist. And then to the point about reflecting diversity, I just wanted to plug, like, I know it can be challenging to talk to kids because of, I know a lot of newsrooms have, policies as far as like getting parental permission and stuff like that, and that's totally valid and like needed. But a lot of the discussion here in Florida, and I know, at the national level now, has been about youth, and it's specifically about trans youth and gender nonconforming youth. And I just can't say enough about like trying to have youth voices in your coverage. A lot of times, like a lot of the youth I've talked to for stories were kids who would take a day off school and go to Tallahassee, and which is where the Florida Capitol is, and testify before a legislative committee talking about how a gender affirming care ban will affect them. And oftentimes, if they're doing that kind of level of work, their parents are aware of it and are supportive of them speaking in the media. It obviously gets more challenging when you have youth who don't have supportive family structures. But I just, I think that's a really important voice in this conversation. And kids already aren't quoted enough, frankly, in media, just kids generally as a population. And especially queer youth, I think, they have a lot to say, and are going to be, potentially the policymakers of tomorrow. So just wanted to plug the importance of that, I think.
I wanted to thank you for that, because I used to edit a teen section, and I started it for the very reason that you just said, because kids have viewpoints, they have things to say, and they usually are not in the paper for whatever reason. And they are, whether they're allies or whether they are identifying as pan or gender fluid or whatever, they are, for example, we have a friend of mine's daughter spoke to the school board because their library chose to ban this book and this book and this book and this book. They have things to say, and I would, whether or not they identify as LGBT, to include youth in your coverage. I think that's really critical.
All right, hopefully that answered your question, Savannah. Until we have 10 minutes until we wrap. So if anyone has any other questions, pop them in there. One question I definitely wanted to get to before we wrap: how does everyone ensure that your LGBTQ coverage reflects the full diversity of the communities, including Black folks, people of color, people of different economic backgrounds and ages, and the list goes on? So how are you making sure that your coverage is specifically speaking to the full rainbow within this rainbow?
GLAAD has expanded their work into focusing on local news coverage. And my colleague, Darren Aaron, who is actually based in Atlanta and I believe has worked with Sharif in the past, has ensured that that Black voices and HIV stories are essential in LGBTQ coverage. And that's one of the things that I've done here in Texas, is make sure that brown voices, Latina voices, especially given the fact that HIV rates among Latinos, among queer Latino men, is raising comparatively to other communities. I want to make sure that story is connected and seen through to the media, and so that ensures that both the Latina and LGBTQ community is seen through, and that it requires a connection. That requires diversity within organizations. That requires diversity within newsrooms, to ensure that that all communities are seen and validated.
I piggyback on the idea that having diverse leaders in newsroom, having diverse reporters on the street, causes that. I mean, I find stories because I'm out here in these streets, man. I see stories in my real life, so I can bring them to the newsroom. So that's key. And particularly here in the South, I mean, there's a narrative during all of that electoral discussion of trans people, moving to Europe and moving to the North, like the Underground Railroad. And that's like, let's be real, that's like 3 people. People don't have the resources to do that. People have roots where they are. So the real story of trans people in the South is going to remain in the South. And so having a dominant narrative of people moving isn't the only story to tell in that space. And so people just have to be, either be in the community or Do the work. You know, it can't be an excuse that, oh, I can ignore as part of the community because it's not my lived experience. There are great reporters who aren't from a particular community who do the work to get to know that community. And we know in politics that these communities are a priority to discuss, and therefore newsrooms should make it a priority to pay attention to them.
And this is something that's a work in progress for even people that really focus on LGBTQ stories. In 2015, when everyone was doing same-sex marriage stories, I found couples. I found 2 women. I found 2 men. I found different parts of our coverage area, but I didn't find people of color, and that's on me. And I should have found somebody who was representing a small but still significant part of some of our coverage areas. So this is something that I learn every day. I think that's one of the best parts about being a journalist, and so that means that I will do better next time, and that's just a really important point. And
Yeah.
I haven't said this, but Sharif, it's great to see you. I haven't seen you in a very long time. So hello.
So same here, and no one's covering these issues perfectly, and so we all have a lot to learn.
And I think something, if in your reporting process, you're only hearing from one sort of source, if only one demographic of person is agreeing to talk to you for the story and everyone else is turning you down, you should think about, is there some sort of bias inherent to the way that I am framing this story as a journalist and approaching this story as a journalist? And you should ask the people who aren't talking to you, what do you care about? What part of this issue am I not getting? What do you want to talk to me about? And what do you want to see in the news? Maybe you don't do a story that's immediately based on that, but having that conversation is important, and paying attention to the people who you can't bring into your story will probably tell you something about the limitations of your own work and assumptions and misconceptions that you might have that you don't even realize are influencing your journalism.
Right. All fantastic points. Okay, we've got 7 minutes left, so I am going to ask for a round table from everyone. We'll just go one to the next. Let's end this conversation on a constructive note. What is one specific actionable piece of advice that you can give to journalists who want to improve their queer coverage but don't know where to start? I am going to start with, actually, who wants to start first? Okay, then I'm just gonna have to call on someone. Sharif, I'm gonna call on you. Oh, okay,
Okay.
go.
I was just gonna. It's not difficult really. It's just what you as a journalist should be doing for anything. Go where the people are. Go to a meeting. Go to a event. On Pride, there are tons of organizations that have tables. Talk to them, spend time with them. There's a lot of events this month happening. There's a community center having a barbecue. I mean, it's really not difficult. You have to take the time to do the work in order to make your stories better, I think. And I see it from some reporters who really have no idea. They don't know anyone who's gay. They don't know anyone who's, part of our community. And, they don't even know where to start. So that's where I can come in. That's where other people can come in and help them, because there are some leaders in the community who will take the time to talk about pride and the importance of pride. And I remember once we had a reporter cover, they didn't know the history. And it's just, you have to take the time. You have to take the time. And if I can be of any help to reporters on staff or to the region, that's what I will do.
Yeah. Who's next?
I would also say that intersectional queer voices, kind of going back to that, can also help with your non-LGBTQ coverage. And I think that just overall, you just utilizing LGBTQ sources for all of your reporting builds trust within the community. If you're talking about public safety, if you're talking about economics, if you're talking about other issues that affect other marginalized communities, that affects queer people too. And so that includes you going out and meeting these people who are part of an intersectional cause, whether they're advocates in their own rights, whether they're just members of the community. Building that trust between those sources can give you the insight for numerous stories, for numerous forms of your reporting. With the state of journalism, it requires everyone to have a pretty diverse range of reporting. You might be doing this story one day, the next story the next day. So that's also something to remember. And then I would just also and Sharif talked about this a little bit, is people in the South specifically out there. LGBTQ people are in the South. We are the largest representation of LGBTQ people, which is in the South, and I'm going to include Texas in that. Many assumptions are made about the South. Many assumptions are made about Texas, but I promise you, if you connect with the local if you connect with local organizations, Equality Texas, Texas Latino Pride, numerous organizations, you will find the necessary sources who are facing the setbacks that you hear so much about in this state. And that must be included in your coverage. In your coverage.
I'm gonna
Okay.
cut you off because we're running out of time. I'm gonna let everybody else go, but you got 30 seconds. Everyone, keep it 30 seconds or shorter.
I'll just say, do what Kae suggested, or at least riff off of it, and take someone to coffee or tea and ask them about what they're running into in their life. Don't ask them to pitch you a story, but ask them, hey, what things are you running into that are just really interesting? And I bet there's a story in that.
Kathryn, what do you have quickly?
I would say, I mean, second what Bill says, and everyone, but getting out in the community is most important. But there's also, you can follow a lot of, like on social media, follow queer informational accounts, queer history. There's a great Substack by an activist journalist, Aaron Reed, Aaron in the Morning, that covers like a ton of trans legislation and policy that's happening around the country. And sometimes I get ideas off of reading that newsletter. There's tons of history, stories and resources out there too. So just even, adding those types of accounts into your normal like doom scrolling diet can like give you ideas and places to start, with LGBTQ stories.
Okay.
I'm going to say go read the TJA style guide. We have a lot of resources on understanding not just like context and not just definitions and sort of language, but also context and common stories, common issues you might run into. It'll help you, especially if you're uncertain about best practices or language, or you feel kind of uncertain about how to engage with people. It'll help you feel more secure in your knowledge base for doing stories on LGBTQ communities.
And I'll throw this out, especially for people who have nowhere, who's never done this work before and knows nowhere to start. Every year, NLGJA lists an abundance of awards of people from both on the local and national side. Take some of those ideas and tweak it for your local newsroom. If you see something, there's an idea. IRE does something similar, not with queer stories, but with investigative stories in general. Take those ideas and see how it applies into your local newsroom. Elliot, I think I have to now turn it over to you.